Vampires are amongst the most reconstructed and scrutinized literary figures in history. Whether it is the gothic machinations of Dracula or the teenage heartthrob Edward Cullen, vampires continue to evolve to meet the contemporary anxieties of the time in the page, on the television, and in the cinema. However, one area that I've found vampires are also prominent but not really explored academically is the world of interactive media, such as video games and board games. This is a shame, as not only are vampires full of cultural capital that can create immediate connection with the player without a lot of passive exposition, but games as a medium also have been able to explore the vampire figure in challenging ways, extending the tropes that surround them and new and exciting approaches. My book, Vampires in Interactive Media Playing Dead, published by Edinburgh University Press, shows that vampires in games have a unique relationship due to several factors. Firstly, as mentioned above, the vampire is a figure that contains a great deal of cultural expectations and assumptions that can be readily used by the game's writers and designers to create an immediate hook for the player. This is important as interactive texts do not have the luxury of having time for exposition, as moments of exposition often come at the direct expense of interactivity. This can lead sometimes to something called ludonarrative dissonance, where the written narrative of the game, otherwise known as the emergent narrative, contradicts with the interactive experience created by the player. Strong thematic figures like the vampire can help bridge these two narrative threads by allowing players to feel that the game's thematic elements inform and enhance the mechanical ideas rather than work against them. Fury of Dracula, on the screen at the moment, is elevated to something more than simply a hidden movement game where one player evades a team of other players because it is able to incorporate familiar aesthetics and tropes to become Dracula playing cat and mouse across Europe against famous hunters such as Mina Harker and Van Helsing. Vampiric tropes, therefore, create greater opportunity for player engagement. Another valuable element of vampires that create inherent tension in the gaming space is the liminal area that they operate in. A vampire, by most accounts, can pass off as a human and thus hide under others' assumptions before subverting these same suppositions at a time when it suits them. The social deduction game One Night Ultimate Vampire has certain players taking the role of vampires, using their abilities to sabotage the actions of the opposing villagers and creating doubt and falsehoods about the information that they have. Such sabotage would not be possible if the villagers were readily able to identify the vampires, nor would it create a sense of tension as the vampires attempt to hide in plain sight in order to win the game. The natural arc of feigning to be human before being revealed as other, either by the opposing players who have managed to glean the correct piece of information, or by the vampire's own agency, is an excellent natural arc that games can use to create an experience around. One of the more obvious ways that players can create an immediate connection with the characters they play in a game, otherwise known as their avatar, is to allow players to have more choice around the aesthetics and mechanics to create avatars that are more tailor made for players' tastes. Vampires, as exemplified by their range of reinterpretations, allow designers to create not only a customized immortal life, but also a customized mortal life. Such flexibility allows the vampires in games to be incredibly varied, both as avatars and non player characters, otherwise known as NPCs. A great example of this is in the role playing game Vampire the Masquerade, where you will often see players creating a huge range of avatars from a long line of different abilities and aesthetics. Thus, when they all get together to create a party, they truly reflect a diversity of choices. Thus, vampires can represent a whole range of ideas that can create an immediate sense of status, goals, and needs to the player, informed by both their mortal and vampiric lives. Indeed, as I interviewed more and more players from the playing community, I was struck to find that how this sort of customization allows players to create avatars that explore lots of themes in a way that still allows them agency. Difficult themes such as alienation, sexuality, and mental illness. One of the most important ways that games can bring characters to life uniquely is not just through their aesthetics or their themes, but rather their mechanics. It is through these mechanics, that is, the combination of choices and restrictions that players are given, that allow the player to formulate strategies, allow them to feel, to paraphrase Gregory Little, that their avatar is an extension of their own decisions. Vampires not only have obvious characteristics that players know about, but they have characteristics that can be implemented almost seamlessly into interactive media. For example, the vampire's arguably core tenet, the idea that they rob others' vitality to supplement their own, is a perfect strategic element that designers can implement in a variety of different ways. The video game Vampire, for example, has a player able to use a bite attack to drain the enemy's health to add to their own. However, this attack often leaves the player open to other attacks, causing the player to have to think about risk and reward. Taking into account how designers can also use ideas like vampires' aversion to sunlight and the ability to turn to bats and wolves amongst a myriad of other powers, and it is easy to see how vampires can create mechanics that players can respond to instinctively without a lot of questioning and exposition. Through this, the player has allowed another level of engagement, which creates another level of interest within the game and allows them to feel closer to their avatar. Furthermore, games also allow vampires to focus on different aspects that are often glossed over in text or film. Dracula, in both its film adaptations and novels, is portrayed as a great warlord in general, but little is actually known about his strategic nous. Instead, much of the focus is on Dracula as warrior, cutting down his enemies by the dozen. However, in grand strategy games such as Total War Warhammer, we can see vampires as the centerpiece of shambling undead armies, while solitary role playing games such as Thousand Year Old Vampire can have the avatar living their life over centuries and consuming the trends and norms that change over time, much like Anne Rice alludes to with the Brat Prince Lestat in her Vampire Chronicles series. Therefore, while narrative mediums can allude to the notion of time passing, games can truly show the unique benefits as well as the burdens that time can bring upon vampires, and how it affects the way they see the world as general, administrator, or indeed just as immortal. Finally, this book aims to show that vampires, as figures of great potential for greed, tragedy, and even redemption, are a great conduit to show the unique storytelling possibilities that interactive media can provide. This is not only because the game allows the player to choose different pathways and destinies for their characters and avatars, but also it creates a unique engagement should the player form an attachment through the world around their avatar and the characters beyond. Astarion, the vampiric spawn from Baldur's Gate 3, is a character who allies with the player avatar and often puts the rest of the party offside with his haughty demeanor. However, if the player chooses to talk more to him, Astarion will open up, telling the player that he was turned into a vampiric spawn by a high ranking vampire who wishes to sacrifice Astarion as well as many others to elevate themselves to deity like status. While Astarion at first wishes to replace this evil vampire master with himself, he can be convinced by the player to dismiss the ritual altogether and save all the other vampiric spawn in order to take a more good, virtuous path. These options are predicated, like all choices in games, on the player engaging with elements of the ludic world through their avatar. In other words, vampires are great characters to reward players' engagement by unearthing hidden depths, but also allowing the player to affect the world around them, possibly being the crucial element to see if vampires are actually damned or can be redeemed. In order to do this, this book will be split into 8 chapters. Essentially, that can be categorized into 3 different parts. The first chapter deals with vampires as that most compelling and famous game antagonist, the boss. In this chapter, I look at how vampires create compelling characters for players to come up against during their game experience. Vampires in such games have come to represent things as diverse as Victorian aristocratic privilege, as well as military industrial complexes. Not only that, but vampires can be impressive mechanical puzzles with different powers and resistances than the typical henchman. These puzzles can not only be worked out in real time as the player fights them, but also other games will take the time to have players learn more about the vampiric boss's weakness before culminating in a final battle, therefore categorizing and reducing the supernatural other. Chapter 2 then moves on from the vampiric antagonist to start focusing on the vampiric avatar and examining how games aesthetically and mechanically can construct vampiric avatars for players. It will then show how the rebirth of the vampiric avatar can parallel the player's own growing education of how to engage with the virtual world around them. More intriguingly, vampires in games, as explored in Chapter 3, can move beyond the static anachronisms of times past to figures that can level up and therefore experience real growth within the video game setting. By doing this, games can create vampiric avatars that are more connected to the players inhabiting them, as they make choices as how they want to strategically and narratively interact with the virtual world. In the second collection of chapters, we move on to specific aspects of vampirism and how they're expressed in the interactive world. Chapter 4 focuses on the vampire as a silent predator, lurking in the shadows and picking off their prey one by one in hidden movement and social deduction board games. These games rely on the idea of a small number of vampiric players having a surplus of information that they can use to undermine a larger group of opposing players that have far less information. Vampires are ideal for these sort of games, as not only are they creatures that often lurk under the nose of those they hunt, but they create a natural arc where the opposing players can attempt to gain more information to create an intriguing hunt as the noose tightens. The book then moves on in Chapter 5 to the push-pull elements of a vampire's bestial and immortal natures set against the humanity they may still be harboring. Indeed, games are able to mechanically illustrate how a vampire can not only leave their mortal connections behind, but also then extrapolate this to create vampiric communities where their norms are dictated more by this immortality and attachment. Games can therefore engage players by having their vampires make the easy choice by losing some of their humanity, but as a result lose out in engaging with the wider world. Then in Chapter 6 of the book, we will look at the vampire not as an isolated figure, but a ruler who interacts not through infiltration and illegitimacy, but through overt commands that allow the vampire to reflect themes such as exploitation, war, and societal manipulation through an overt, legitimate hierarchy. This culminates in the idea of the legacy board game, where vampire machinations not only extend through the virtual years, but through board game session to board game session, affecting latter board game sessions as the player's actions permanently affect the board game state, whether it be through recruiting new vampires to the cause, or whether it be undermining various actions and maps of the player board. Finally, the third section of the book will utilize interviews that I have done with the gaming community in order to discuss the way games involving vampires have engaged with this said community in order to progress forward. Chapter 7 discusses the way that games involving vampires have often utilized insensitive tropes and idioms that have given rise to accusations of Orientalism, sexism, and ableism. What makes this particularly interesting is how player reactions to this clumsy portrayals of Gothic sensibilities have helped these games often to look beyond novels of the 19th century to something more progressive and original. This brings us on to Chapter 8, where the book examines how vampires create intriguing environments of interactivity in tabletop role-playing games and live-action role-playing games, not merely between the player and the game, but also between players. Such interactions create evolved role-playing game frameworks, where the discrete narrative, mechanical, and social frameworks become more liminal and negotiated. By interviewing people in the gaming community, it allowed me to show how this new evolved framework not only allows for more fluid dynamics to be emphasized between players, but also allows players to examine and illustrate darker and even traumatic experiences more deeply in a safe space. Indeed, through role-playing games such as Vampire the Masquerade, Players I've interviewed have been able to explore ideas such as body dysmorphia, toxic relationships, and queerness while still keeping a sense of agency because of the fact that the mechanical elements of the game were not simply predicated on a dice roll, but are rather negotiation between the player, the other players around the table, and the game master. Finally, this chapter will also look at the way that vampires have often allowed us to look back on traumatic world events, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, and how being an outsider to it, as vampires often are, allow us to think about these things through a new perspective, giving us distance through what is obviously a horrific time. The book looks at a range of games throughout the late 20th and 21st centuries that involve vampires. In order to do this, the book has touched upon the ideas of several academics within the spheres of vampires, as well as interactive media. Lorna Piatti-Farnell's work on vampires, particularly her work on the body transformation, was vital to illustrate the fluid and liminal space that vampires exist in. Furthermore, Nina Auerbach and Stacey Abbott's works on the evolution of the vampire figure made it easy to place these figures on a larger context, to show how vampires in games have often encouraged a return to the three-dimensional unique individual in the face of films such as Priest and I Am Legend, where the vampires were often conflated with tropes of the zombie. This is extended by authors such as Simon Bacon, Laura Davidel, and in particular Saoirse Ní Fiann, who examine the way that vampires have often been consumers not just of blood, but of trends, becoming true postmodernists. By using these sources, the book can show how the consumption of trends is a potential act of agency which games are perfectly poised to utilize. This book also referred to the work of Edward Said and Stephen Arata, as well as Amanda Powell and Stephanie Linsop, to explore how vampires in games explore, sometimes problematically, ideas around the Orient and sexuality, respectively. Along with the vampire scholarship above, the book has also looked at interactive media theorists, such as Keith Bergen, Jasper Juhl, and 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿𝗁, to examine how games create mechanical engines that not only help tell stories through interactivity, but also emphasize uncertainty to allow players to learn through failure and creativity. I have also used Gregory Little's work on the Avatar as a foundation to talk about how vampires are ideal figures to inhabit the liminal space between the real and the virtual. In addition, this book looks to authors who look at more specific mediums and genres to ensure that the various nature of these interactive media can not only be acknowledged, but common threads between these specific different types can be used to emphasize the vampire's potency. This includes Marco Arnardo and Paul Booth for board games, Mariano Stenros and Harakar, I apologize if that's the wrong pronunciation, for the spectacle and hobby of wargaming, and Michael J. Kreska and Jennifer 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿𝗄𝗏 for the ideas on tabletop role-playing games, including the conventions and norms that surround aspects such as dice rolling and character creation. 𝗔𝗀𝘀𝗁𝗏 was in particular was integral, as their framework of tabletop role-playing was the foundation for the book's more evolved liminal framework, as seen before in this presentation. Vampires gain so much of their power through identity and interacting with the world around them. Whether it be having power over the rest of the dead or seducing and feeding of the living, vampires are therefore ideal figures to illustrate the possibility of the interactive format. This book shows that by using them, games have also opened up new ideas of how to take the figure forward into the future. Thank you so much for this opportunity.